Welcome to Chapter 11, Physical and Cognitive Development in Early Adulthood. In this time period, we'll be looking at development through the 20s and 30s, which we define as early adulthood. The topics in this chapter are as follows: the transition from adolescence to adulthood. We'll talk a little bit about the emerging adulthood phase of development. We'll then get into physical development, sexuality, cognitive development, and finally careers and work. In this first video, we'll be looking at the transition from adolescence to adulthood as well as physical development. This first section of transitioning is a very small section. We're just going to tackle becoming an adult. You can read about the transition to college from high school on your own. So what's involved in transitioning to adulthood? Well, I mentioned this back in chapter 1, we have a new time period that's been added to the lifespan approach to developmental psychology. We call it emerging adulthood. It is a transitional stage from adolescence to adulthood, approximately from 18 to 25 years of age. It's characterized by experimentation and exploration as the individual, attempts to firm up and eventually achieve their identity. I did talk about this, somewhat back in chapter 1, but I'll go over a couple of the main details. Again, it is a new time period because society has changed. We used to expect adolescents to transition straight into adulthood, basically by the time they got to be about 20. Really, it went from when you went from your teens to your 20s, you made that transition to adulthood. It may have been 21 in some cases, but basically it was right around the transition out of your teenage years. That was fine in the past when there were enough well-paying jobs available that anyone that had the desire could find a decent paying job and become self-sufficient and afford a place to live and to be self-sufficient enough to manage on their own. That is no longer the case in society. We lost a lot of our less skilled type jobs, factory jobs and things like that, either to automation, more machines doing the work, or to outsourcing to other countries where the labor is cheaper. And so as we lost these unskilled labor jobs, it became harder and harder to expect a 20-year-old to be able to be self-sufficient, with a lack of education. And this is one of the reasons why more and more people have gone to college and university, and why this time period developed is that we now find it common for people in their early 20s to still be living at home. They're not expected to be on their own and to be self-sufficient. We expected it to take longer, and this is what led to the development of emerging adulthood. It's kind of, some people would say it's like an extended adolescence. You have more time to figure yourself out and to figure out where you're heading and to figure your identity out and to get yourself established. And so adulthood has been pushed back. Rather than starting at 20, we're not really starting it now till 25, according to this time period and in this new lifespan model. This time period really doesn't appear in every culture, this new emerging adulthood time period. It appears in cultures where assuming an adult role and responsibilities has been postponed, such as in our culture and other advanced cultures, industrialized cultures. This is the case in many industrialized advanced cultures. But this time period has been criticized as applying mainly only to adolescents who are privileged and live in such a country as ours. If you were living in some third world country, for instance, you're not extending your adolescence and pushing your adulthood back, a number of years, you would be expected, if anything, to become an adult earlier in such a country. There would be no emerging adulthood period where, oh, I have more years to explore and experiment before I really settle down. So it really does only apply to industrialized advanced countries like our country and most European countries, but not a lot of poor or third world countries. You really won't find an emerging adulthood period. Some of the key features, uh, uh, these come from a researcher who does a lot of work in this area. His name is Jeffrey Arnett, Arnett, and he talks about some of the key features of emerging adulthood. It's a time of identity exploration, especially in love and work. So you're figuring out, what kind of relationship you want to settle into, what kind of work do you want to do, and these are some of the ideas or crises that you're tackling during these years. It is a time of instability, and Jeffrey Arnett says that this is like physical instability where you're moving often during these years. You might move between relationships as well as between living arrangements. You might move between jobs or different majors if you're in school. And so it is. His research does say that people tend to be somewhat unstable or unstable, and this is part of the idea that they are experimenting and exploring different options. Um, and it's a time of being self-focused because there are few obligations or commitments that are expected of most people in this age category. Like I said, as a society, we're not expecting people in their early 20s to be self-sufficient, or we're not expecting them to be adults. And it's a feeling of in between. You're not an adolescent anymore, but you're not quite an adult either. So he called it the age of possibilities, Jeffrey Arnett, a time when individuals have an opportunity to transform their lives. He says it's a time of optimism about your future. That you, especially if you had difficulties growing up, if you're coming from some kind of poor or negative upbringing in one way or another, it's a time where you can kind of start over and start fresh and looking ahead to your adult years. And so he really believes it's an optimistic time. Okay. The transition to adulthood has markers in various societies and countries, and they're not. Some countries have a very clear marker; others, it's kind of a combination of factors. Um, in the U.S., the main marker of adulthood is holding a full-time job. Um, this is when we see people in their 20s, get a full-time job where they're making enough money to now, have some economic independence, to be able to take care of themselves and take responsibility for themselves. I mean, all this kind of follows from having a good, well-paying full-time job, and that's going to be stable. And so this is kind of our main marker. When we see somebody do that, we say, "Oh, he's becoming an adult, or she's becoming an adult now because she now has money coming in." And this is very different than just having a low-paying or a part-time job that's not enough to live on. In other cultures, it may be very different markers. Just to give an example, in Bangladesh, as one example, I mean, they have a very clear marker that when you get married, you become an adult. And until you're married, you're not considered an adult. So it doesn't really matter how old you are. It's not about jobs or finances. It's about getting married to enter into adulthood. Okay. Physical development is the next topic. We'll look at physical performance and development, health, eating and weight, regular exercise, and substance abuse. Let's begin with physical performance and development. Our peak physical performance typically occurs between the years of 19 and 26. So kind of in that emerging adulthood period is when we reach our overall overall peak, physical peak. It does differ though, depending on what if you're playing some types of sports, your peak performance will differ depending on the type of sport it is. I mean, different sports require different abilities. So your book gives some examples. Swimmers and gymnasts, well, they peak early. Typically, their late teenage years are when they do their best performance. If you've ever watched Olympics or major worldwide competitions, you will see a lot of teenage swimmers and gymnasts competing. On the on a later side, we have golfers or marathon runners. They don't really reach a peak performance until the late 20s. So the swimmers and gymnasts were late teenage years, and then golfers and marathon runners, it's like 10 years later, they start peaking around the late 20s. It requires, more of a buildup of certain skills that take longer to develop in those particular sports. A lot of other sports are in between those two examples. In the early 20s, things like um, baseball and basketball, the kind of some of the major sports, baseball, basketball, hockey. You tend to find peak physical performance often in the early to mid 20s. Football would be included in this. Um, but once again, even football, it depends on the position you're playing. I mean, quarterbacks tend to reach their peaks a little bit later than some other positions. So it does really vary from one sport to another. Um, Muscle tone and strength usually begin to decline approximately at age 30. It starts going downhill already. So you have a short kind of window of peak performance in your 20s, late teens and 20s. As far as health, the emerging adults have twice the mortality rate of that of adolescents. We can see that in this next slide. So on the left, we have 12 to 17-year-olds, and this is, the looking at the number of deaths, the mortality rates per 100,000, and how many die, and you could, but just comparing the two bars on the left to the two bars on the right, going from teenage years to what we call emerging adulthood, 18 to 24. I mean, you can see it's mainly the males that are responsible for the higher emerging adult, mortality rate. Certainly, the females really jump up as well. They double, but the males are basically tripling their rate from teenage years to emerging adulthood. Well, think about that time frame, 18 to 24. During that time frame, you reach drinking age, and uh, adults at that age are driving. The majority of adults are driving by then, and so mixing that with reaching drinking age, often these are the college years, and there's a lot of opportunity for people to have injuries, particularly driving injuries, and those that involve alcohol are very prominent in this age category. So you can see unintentional injuries are about half of that half of those bars. But certainly the males really, the death rate of males really increases in early adulthood or emerging adulthood compared to teenage years. Let me go back here. There's more chronic health problems in emerging adulthood compared to earlier time periods. Emerging adults engage in more health compromising behaviors. This is because studies show that during that time period of 18 to 25, that age category really fails to develop health promoting habits because they don't really consider how their lifestyle is going to affect them later in life. We're not good at looking ahead at what's the long-term implications of my habits I'm developing now. I mean, in our late teens and early 20s, we tend to feel like we're just so fit and that it's okay to drink a little or smoke a little or do I'm going to slack off my exercise for a while. I can do it later, and I can eat whatever I want. I mean, and you can kind of get away with some of those behaviors in the short run, and And because we're not good at really looking at long term, we don't really think about the chronic implications of things like how it's going to affect us with things like heart disease and hypertension and diabetes later, and I mean um, cancer and things like that. I mean, and so we tend to kind of live loose and so do more health compromising behaviors because while we're young and without looking ahead. We don't really start looking ahead till really, when you get to middle adulthood, you start thinking, okay, I should really think about my future and some of the behaviors I'm doing. But unfortunately, unless you're very, what's the word I'm looking for? Unless you're uh, very, the word's escaping me. Unless you're very conscientious. Okay, that's the word I'm looking for. Uh, those that are very people that are very conscientious tend to, do better habits and habits that are good for the long term. But others, that are lower in conscientiousness tend to live for the day in their emerging adult years. Emerging adults are more likely to be obese than in any generations in the past. A recent analysis predicted that by the year 2030, so 10 years from now, 42% of U.S. adults will be obese. 42%, almost half of U.S. adults are going to be obese, 10 years from now, based on these predictions. U.S. had the highest percentage of obese adults in a recent comparison of 33 developed countries. So obesity is certainly a problem. Okay, let me move on here. Eating and weight. So speaking of obesity, it is linked to increased risk of hypertension, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. These are a few of the long-term negative outcomes I was talking about as far as chronic disorders that build up over many years of bad habits. Obesity is associated with mental health issues as well. Some factors involved: heredity, so there is a genetic contribution. Some people are just more likely to be obese than others. It doesn't cause you to be obese, but it makes it more or less likely, your genes. Environmental factors are certainly at play. For example, a decline in activity, is going to make you gain weight. People that live in lower SES circumstances are more likely to be heavier and more likely to be obese versus higher SES living conditions. It's because cheaper food tends to be not as good for you. Good food, good quality food that's good for your body tends to cost more. So people in the lower SES categories tend to eat more fast foods and processed foods because they're cheap and they taste good, and but they're obviously not good for you and they do put weight on. Dieting versus dieting exercise programs. There's plenty of results that show the importance of exercise for losing weight. When you compare dieting alone versus dieting and exercise, those that do dieting and exercise are much more likely to lose weight versus those that only diet. The most effective weight loss programs invariably include exercise. This is just one result from one study looking at those that were successful versus unsuccessful. And you can see that the largest bar for success was people exercising 30 minutes per day. Along with it certainly helps to have planned meals. These are kind of the top three things. It also helps to weigh yourself daily somewhat, but certainly in many comparisons, exercise is really the key, more so than calorie reduction or watching what you eat or carb restrictions or things like that. It is including exercise in your daily routine. So this brings us to exercise. It helps prevent chronic disorders. Aerobic exercise is very good for you. It stimulates heart and lung activity. Exercise benefits are both physical and mental. So it helps you mentally as well as physically. I mean, the physical is more obvious, but it's been shown in studies that regular exercise is a preventative factor for anxiety and depression disorders. And when I say preventative, it makes it less likely. It doesn't completely prevent, but okay. You can read about those strategies on your own. Substance abuse. Most of us know what addiction is. It's an overwhelming involvement using a drug and a preoccupation with securing its supply. When you are addicted, you continue to regularly use the drug. You need to get more of it. Okay. Alcohol is certainly one concern for younger adults, um, particularly um, those that engage in pre-gaming or those that engage in binge drinking or extreme binge drinking. And this is the time that this happens is mainly in the college years. In those emerging adult years. It's far less of a concern for older adults. Obviously, if you don't know already, pre-gaming, and this is something I just recently learned, or maybe a year or two ago, but I never knew there was a name for it. But drinking before going out to some event, you start drinking ahead of time because I guess it's cheaper and it gets you ready for the event. And that's common among college students that are going to events. Binge drinking is more than five or more drinks in a night, and they when they survey college students, they ask them if they've engaged in that and sometime in the past 2 weeks. Based on a national survey in 2016, they found that 32% of U.S. college students said that they had been involved in binge drinking sometime in the past previous 2 weeks. So this is telling us that in a 2 week period, about 1/3 of U.S. college students can be expected to binge drink. Extreme binge drinking is 10 to 15 or more drinks in a row in the last, at some point in one night during the last 2 weeks. Once again, this is not 5 drinks like during the past 2 weeks. It's 5 drinks in one sitting, in one night during the past 2 weeks. So 10 to 15 drinks in one sitting, one night, sometime in the last 2 weeks. When they asked college students in the U.S., they found that 12% of them have been involved in extreme binge drinking. The reason we worry about binge drinking or extreme binge drinking is this is when it creates the most chance for harm to an individual. When you obviously when you drink to excess, you're much more likely to do stupid things and be harmed or have accidents and etc. These numbers have been declining though, those percentages I gave you. So I mean, we have been kind of, as a country, going in the right direction as far as cutting down on the amount of binge drinking going on in the college and university populations. Obviously, the one negative long-term effect of drinking too much repeatedly is alcoholism. Refers to long-term, repeated, uncontrolled, compulsive, and excessive alcohol use, which impairs the user's health and relationships. Here's just a quick chart looking at binge drinking in going from age 18 up all the way up to 35-year-olds, and you can see from this study that it really peaks around the age of 21 to 22. Once again, real early adulthood. Well, many states have 21 as the legal drinking age, so it's not surprising that right after people reach the age of 21, you see this spike in binge drinking. The levels remain high throughout through up to about the mid 20s, and then you see it starts to decline somewhat in the late 20s and into the 30s. So, but certainly in these emerging adult years is when we're really concerned about the binge drinking and the result. Once again, the results from binge drinking are things like DUIs and accidents and accidental deaths and unintended pregnancies, etc. Okay, and that brings us to sexuality. which I will cover in the next video.